December 6, 1942, RAF Chelmsford, England. The frost clung to every surface as Colonel Curtis LeMay stood before the map in the briefing room, his cigar unlit, but clenched between his teeth as always. In 3 hours, 18 B-17 flying fortresses from his 3005th Bombardment Group would attempt something that had never been done before, a formation so tight and so precisely coordinated that it would revolutionize aerial warfare. The target was Lille, France, but the real experiment was the formation itself. What his crews didn't know yet was that this mission would create the blueprint for a defensive system so powerful that Luftwaffe pilots would soon give it a name that translated to flying porcupine, a wall of interlocking machine gun fire so dense that attacking it became a form of calculated suicide. The mathematics were brutal and simple. A single B-17G carried 1350 caliber machine guns. Put 54 of these bombers into a combat wing formation, and an attacking fighter pilot found himself staring down the barrels of over 700 heavy machine guns, all capable of firing 750 rounds per minute with an effective range of 3,500 FT. This was the combat box, and its development would transform the daylight bombing campaign over Europe from a desperate gamble into America's primary weapon for crushing Nazi Germany's industrial capacity. The path to this moment had begun badly. On August 17, 1942, the 8th Air Force flew its first bombing mission from England. 12 B-17E flying fortresses attacked the marshalling yards at Ron-Sotteville in France, escorted by RAF Spitfires. The bombers flew in loose 6-plane squadrons, with 2 to 4 miles between each squadron, a formation designed primarily to prevent mid-air collisions between inexperienced crews rather than to provide mutual defensive fire. Within each squadron, bombers were stacked at 3 altitudes, with approximately 150 FT between the highest and lowest aircraft. All aircraft returned safely with only 2 sustaining minor flak damage. But American air commanders knew this shallow penetration into occupied France represented nothing close to what would be required. The real targets lay deep inside Germany beyond the range of any escort fighter then available. The bombers would have to defend themselves. The operational challenge was immense. Strategic bombing doctrine called for precision daylight attacks on specific industrial targets. Factories producing aircraft components, ball bearings, synthetic oil, and other war materials essential to the German military machine. But reaching those targets meant flying hundreds of miles through hostile airspace, facing both German fighters and anti-aircraft artillery. From bases in East Anglia to targets in central Germany was over 500 miles each way. At bomber cruising speeds of 180 mph, missions lasted 8 to 10 hours. Crews would spend that entire time at altitudes of 25,000 to 30,000 FT, where temperatures reached 40 degrees and below zero, and oxygen was required for survival. The B-17E that flew those early missions carried 950 caliber Browning M2 machine guns, a massive improvement over earlier models. 2 were mounted in a powered top turret located behind the cockpit. 2 more were in a powered belly turret, the revolutionary Sperry ball turret that allowed a gunner to rotate 360 degrees. 2 guns were in the tail turret, manually operated but providing critical rear defense. Additional guns were positioned in the radio operator's compartment and in waist positions on either side of the rear fuselage, plus a single flexible gun in the nose. The Browning M2 weighed 64 lb, measured 57 in long, and fired 750 rounds per minute with an effective range of 3,500 FT, significantly longer than the German 20mm MGFF cannons initially used by Luftwaffe fighters. The physical demands on B-17 gunners were extraordinary. The ball turret gunner, typically the smallest crew member, entered his position through a hatch in the fuselage floor, then spent the entire mission crouched in a fetal position in a space measuring approximately 4 FT in diameter, unable to wear a parachute due to space constraints. If the aircraft was hit and going down, he had to rotate his turret to align the hatch with the fuselage opening, exit into the aircraft, retrieve his parachute, and then bail out, all while the bomber was potentially spinning or on fire. The waist gunners stood at open windows where temperatures at altitude reached 40 below zero, and wind speeds of 150 mm per ton roared through the fuselage. They wore electrically heated suits that frequently malfunctioned. Frostbite was common. In November 1942, a Luftwaffe fighter ace named Egon Mayer made a discovery that would force the Americans to completely rethink their defensive strategy. Mayer, who commanded the 3rd Grouper of Jägerschwadron II, identified the bombers' critical weakness. The nose of the aircraft, where the bombardier and navigator worked in a plexiglass enclosure, was defended by only 2 manual 50-caliber machine guns with extremely limited fields of fire forward. Behind that plexiglass sat the cockpit, where pilot and co-pilot controlled the aircraft. A pilot killed at the controls meant the bomber would likely go down even if the rest of the crew survived. Mayer calculated that a head-on attack, though requiring exceptional skill and courage, would allow German fighters to concentrate fire on the bombers' most vulnerable spot. The tactic required attacking from 12-kilometer level directly ahead of the bomber formation, flying straight toward the oncoming bombers at full throttle. On November 23, 1942, flying with his wingman, Georg Peter Ada, Mayer shot down his first B-17 using the head-on attack. Within weeks, the tactic became standard Luftwaffe procedure. By December 1942, the head-on attack was the preferred method of assailing American heavy bombers by Luftwaffe fighter pilots. The closing speed during a head-on attack was approximately 500 mph. The B-17 cruised at about 180 mph. A German FW-190 or Bf-109 attacking at full speed approached at roughly 320 mph. Combined, the closing speed reached 500 mph or about 730 ft/s. A German pilot had perhaps 3 seconds from the time he opened fire at maximum range until he had to break away to avoid collision. In those 3 seconds, a skilled pilot could rake the B-17's nose and cockpit with 20mm cannon fire, killing the pilot and co-pilot, destroying the flight controls, and turning a 4-engine bomber into falling wreckage. This was the tactical problem Curtis LeMay set out to solve in the winter of 1942. LeMay was 36 years old, a colonel commanding the 3005th Bombardment Group. He had taken command on June 2, 1942, having spent the previous decade becoming arguably the finest navigator in the air. His navigation skills were extraordinary. In August 1937, as navigator under pilot and commander Caleb Heinz on a Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress, he helped locate the battleship USS Utah during exercises off California, despite being given wrong coordinates by Navy personnel. In May 1938, LeMay navigated 3 B-17s over 620 nautical miles of open ocean to intercept the Italian liner SS Rex, approximately 725 miles off the American coast. The mission received enormous publicity and demonstrated both the B-17's capabilities and LeMay's navigation skills. By the time LeMay took command of the 3005th Bombardment Group, he had developed clear ideas about how bombers should operate. First, precision bombing required straight and level flight during the bomb run, no matter how heavy the flak or how intense the fighter attacks. The Norden bomb sight required stable flight to calculate the precise release point. Second, LeMay understood that tight formations were essential for concentrated defensive fire. Scattered bombers were vulnerable bombers. Only by flying close together could bombers mass their defensive armament to create overlapping fields of fire. Third, crews needed relentless training until every action became instinctive. LeMay's crews found him demanding, unemotional, and utterly focused on mission success. He drove them hard, and he led by example, flying the toughest missions himself. The existing formations were inadequate. The 6 plane squadrons that flew the early missions were too spread out to provide mutual support. At 2 to 4 mi separation, bombers under attack received no defensive fire support from other aircraft in their squadron. Their 50 caliber guns had an effective range of 3,500 ft, just over half a mile. LeMay needed something tighter, something that would concentrate defensive fire while still allowing bombers to drop their payloads effectively and avoid mid-air collisions. The first improvement came in October 1942, when the 8th Air Force adopted 3 plane elements arranged in a V formation. This basic building block, 3 bombers flying in close formation with 1 lead plane and 2 wingmen, would remain standard throughout the war. But 3 planes were not enough. The breakthrough came in December 1942 with what LeMay called the javelin down formation. This 18-plane formation stacked bombers, both vertically and horizontally, in a pattern that resembled a spear point when viewed in profile. The formation consisted of 6 3-plane elements arranged in 3 squadrons. Each squadron had 2 elements. The squadrons were stacked vertically with the lead squadron in the middle, the high squadron above and to one side, and the low squadron below and to the other side. The key innovation was stacking planes within each element and squadrons within the group downward in the direction of the sun. This aided gunners on higher aircraft in seeing lower aircraft without being blinded by glare, while simultaneously creating overlapping fields of fire that covered every approach angle. The formation was 600 ft high from the lowest bomber to the highest, 500 ft deep from front to back, and nearly 2,500 ft across from one side to the other. Most importantly, every bomber in the formation could bring its guns to bear on an attacking fighter from almost any direction. On December 6, 1942, the 3005th Bomb Group flew the Javelin down formation for the first time in combat during a mission to La France. 18 B-17Fs took off from RAF Chelmsford, climbed to altitude, and formed up into the Javelin down pattern. As they approached the target, German fighters made several passes, but were unable to penetrate the concentrated defensive fire. The results were immediately apparent. German fighters that approached the formation found themselves facing concentrated defensive fire from multiple bombers simultaneously. The interlocking fields of fire created zones where attacking fighters were exposed to guns from 3 or 4 B-17 at once. The formation worked so well that the other 3 B-17 groups in England, the 91st, 3003rd, and 306th Bomb Groups, immediately adopted it after mission debriefings revealed its effectiveness. LeMay wasn't finished. By January 1943, he had refined the formation into a 21-plane wedge, adding a third 3-plane element to the most exposed quadrants for additional support. The most exposed position in the Javelin down formation was the low squadron, which flew below and behind the lead squadron. German fighters quickly learned to attack from below, coming up at the vulnerable low squadron, where their targets were silhouetted against the sky. Adding 3 additional bombers to the low squadron provided concentrated firepower at the formation's most vulnerable point. This configuration was tested in combat, proved effective, and was formally adopted by all groups on January 13, 1943. It became standard through September of that year. The bombers were stacked in a 3-dimensional array that looked like stairs when viewed from the front, a spear point when viewed from the side, and a diamond when viewed from above. Every plane had a specific position, designated by squadron, element, and position number. The lead squadron consisted of 9 aircraft. The high squadron added 3 more bombers to the high right, and the low squadron added 9 more bombers to the low left, for a total of 21 aircraft in the group formation. Every pilot knew his exact position. Maintaining that position was critical. A 1943 Army Air Force's survey found that just over half of all B-7s shot down by the Germans during attacks on European targets were aircraft that had left the main formation. The discipline required to maintain formation was extraordinary. Flying a B-17 in combat formation demanded constant attention and significant physical strength. The pilot had to maintain precise airspeed, altitude, and position relative to other aircraft while wearing heavy clothing, oxygen mask, and flight gear at altitudes where temperatures reached 40 degrees below zero. The turbulence from Prop W wash of leading bombers made formation, flying even more difficult. Each B-7's 4 engines created massive vortices of disturbed air, extending back hundreds of feet behind each bomber. Aircraft flying in trail or in lower positions encountered constant turbulence. The B-7's control system was not power-assisted. Moving the control yoke, rudder pedals, and throttles required physical force. After 6 hours in formation at altitude, pilots' arms felt like concrete. The defensive effectiveness of the combat box became clear during missions in early 1943. On January 27, 1943, the 8th Air Force flew its first mission against a target inside Germany proper, attacking the naval yards at Wilhelmshaven. 53 B-17 and 20 B-24s were dispatched. The 3005th Bomb Group participated, flying in the combat box formation LeMay had developed. German fighters intercepted the formations over the Fian Islands and attacked with typical aggression, but the concentrated defensive fire from the tight formations forced them to break off attacks earlier and made accurate shooting far more difficult. 3 bombers were lost from the entire force, a loss rate of just over 4%, far below the 20% losses that would be sustained on later, unescorted deep penetration missions. The critical vulnerability that remained was the bombers' weak forward armament. Even with the combat box formation providing concentrated defensive fire from the sides, top, bottom, and rear, the head-on attack continued to prove devastatingly effective. Luftwaffe pilots refined their tactics throughout early 1943. Fighter units would position themselves ahead of the bomber stream, then set up their attack runs. They attacked in waves of 3 or 4 aircraft abreast, the K formation, flying straight at the lead bomber formation. At 1,000 watts range, they opened fire with their 20mm cannons and 13mm machine guns. The F-190 fighters carried 4 MG-120mm cannons plus 2 MG-17 machine guns in the later models. At 500 YD, the German pilots would fire a final burst and then execute violent breakaway maneuvers. Some pilots were so skilled and so aggressive that they held their fire until 300 YD or closer, ensuring maximum effect. The Americans attempted various solutions to the forward firepower problem. Some groups experimented with adding single manual 50 caliber guns in a cheek fonts on each side of the nose, giving the navigator and bombardier additional weapons. The cheek guns helped cover some of the forward blind spot, but the fields of fire remained limited. The breakthrough came with the development of a remotely operated chin turret mounting 250 caliber guns directly below the bombardier's position. The Bendix chin turret was electrically powered and could be aimed using a hand control while the gunner sighted through a reflector gun sight. The turret provided true forward firing capability and could track targets through a wide arc covering the entire forward hemisphere. By summer 1943, the B-17G began entering service with the chin turret as standard equipment. This definitive version of the Flying Fortress carried 1350 caliber machine guns, the most heavily armed bomber in the American infantry. The armament was distributed across 5 powered turrets and 4 manual positions. 2 guns in the Bendix chin turret defended against head-on attacks. 2 cheek guns in manual ball socket mounts on either side of the nose provided additional forward coverage. 2 guns in the dorsal turret located just after the cockpit and operated by the flight engineer covered attacks from above and to the sides. 2 guns in the Sperry ball turret mounted in the belly of the aircraft defended against attacks from below. 2 guns in the manual waist. Positions, one on each side of the rear fuselage, covered the beam positions. 1 flexible gun in the radio operator's compartment provided additional coverage from above and rear. Two guns in the tail turret provided critical rear defense. The tail guns had the longest effective killing zone, extending roughly 1,000 yards directly behind the bomber. The B-7G finally provided comprehensive defensive coverage from every angle. A crew of 10 operated the aircraft. The pilot commanded the aircraft and led the crew. The co-pilot assisted with flying duties, managed engine controls, and would take over flying if the pilot was incapacitated. The navigator was responsible for all navigation duties. The bombardier operated the Norden bomb site during the bomb run and also operated the Chin turret before and after the bomb run. The flight engineer monitored engine performance, fuel consumption, hydraulic pressures, electrical systems, and operated the top turret. The radio operator managed all communications and operated the radio room gun. The ball turret gunner spent most of the mission in his spherical turret beneath the aircraft. The two waist gunners stood at open windows on either side of the rear fuselage. The tail gunner occupied the tail position alone, lying prone behind his guns for hours, watching for attacks from behind. The Luftwaffe response to improved bomber armament was to increase their own firepower and develop new tactics. Examination of wrecked B-17s revealed that bringing down a heavy bomber from the rear required approximately 20 hits with 20mm cannon shells. Analysis of combat footage using gun cameras showed that pilots of average ability hit bombers with only about 2% of the rounds they fired when attacking from the rear. The math was brutal. To achieve 20 hits, an average pilot needed to fire 1,020mm rounds, but the early Fowler-Wolf 190 carried only 500 rounds of 20mm ammunition total. Even expending all ammunition provided only 10 hits on average, not enough to guarantee a kill. The solution was heavier weapons. Later versions of the FW-190 carried 4 or even 6 MG-15-120 EM cannons, plus twin MG-131 Roman III motor heavy machine guns. Some aircraft were fitted with experimental heavy cannon. The board cannon BK-37 was a 37mm automatic cannon. The Mk-103 was a 30mm cannon. Some specialized bomber-destroyer aircraft carried even larger weapons. These massive weapons could destroy a bomber with 1 or 2 hits, but they were difficult to aim, heavy reduced aircraft performance, and had very limited ammunition. The Luftwaffe also experimented with unguided rockets. The Vera Granite 21 was a 21 cm rocket carried in simple tube launchers mounted under the wings. The WGR-21 packed massive explosive power. A direct hit would destroy a B-17, but the rockets were difficult to use. They had terrible ballistic properties and no guidance system. Pilots had to fire at ranges of 800 to 1,000 YD outside the effective range of bomber. Defensive guns. Hit rates were extremely low, but the rockets were effective psychological weapons. Seeing large rockets trailing smoke flying toward the formation caused bomber pilots to take evasive action, breaking up the tight formations and disrupting the bomb run. As the 8th Air Force expanded in size during 1943, the combat box formations evolved to accommodate larger numbers of aircraft. By spring 1943, the EATH had grown to 16 groups of B-17 and 4 groups of B-24 Liberators. Mission sizes reached 100 to 200 bombers. The basic group formation of 18 to 21 planes was expanded to create combat wing formations. 3 groups flying together as a wing stacked vertically and horizontally created a 54-plane formation that could project truly massive defensive firepower. This wing box became standard for major missions from early 1943 through May 1944. The groups were positioned with a lead group in the center, a high group above and to one side, and a low group below and to the other side. The wing box occupied a volume of airspace roughly 3,000 ft high, 7,000 ft deep, and 2,000 ft across. The 54-plane combat wing was capable of fielding upwards of 700 heavy-caliber defensive machine guns when fully equipped with B-17Gs. 54 bombers, each carrying 13 guns, equaled 72 heavy machine guns total. A Luftwaffe pilot attacking such a formation faced the reality that dozens of gunners were tracking him visually through their sights and hundreds of bullets were converging on his flight path. The tracer rounds, every fifth round in the belt, created visible streams of fire. From a distance, the formations looked like porcupines with dozens of fiery quills extending in all directions. German fighter pilots began calling the B-7 combat box formations Fliegeswein, flying porcupine, a term that perfectly captured the visual impression and tactical reality of attacking masked bombers. Oberleutnant Heinz Knoke, aka Luftwaffe fighter ace, with 33 confirmed victories flying with Jageschwader. 11 described the experience in his combat diary. Attacking the American bombers is like flying into a wall of fire. He wrote, the tracers come from every direction. You pick your target, line up for the attack, and suddenly the air around you fills with red tracers. You fire your guns, try to get hits on the bomber, and then you dive away praying that nothing vital was hit. Major Anton Haeckel, who ended the war with 192 confirmed victories, explained the tactical problem. If one came in from the rear, there was a long period closing from 1,000 m to our firing range of 400 meters when the bombers were firing at us, but we could not effectively return fire. The 50 caliber guns on the bombers had longer range than our guns. Attacking from the front was better because the closing speed was so high that we were in their firing zone for less time. But the front attacks required much more skill and nerve. The rigid formation discipline required by the combat box created one critical vulnerability that could not be overcome. Individual bombers could not take evasive action while in formation. They had to fly straight and level, maintaining position regardless of flak or fighter attacks. This made the formations vulnerable to German anti-aircraft artillery. The Luftwaffe flak arm eventually numbered over 1 million personnel operating thousands of heavy anti-aircraft guns. The standard German heavy flak gun was the legendary 8.8 8 cm flak 1836-37-41 series, which fired an 8.8 kilo high explosive shell to altitudes exceeding 30,000 GFUR. These guns were positioned in batteries around key targets. When formations approached, the flak batteries would calculate where the formation would be in 30 seconds and fill that airspace with exploding shells. Flak was responsible for 40% of all wounds sustained by 8th Air Force personnel, a higher percentage than fighter attacks. The true test of the combat box formation came during the deep penetration missions of August and October 1943. These missions pushed American bomber doctrine to its absolute limits and revealed both the formation's strengths and its fatal weakness when operating without fighter escort. On August 17, 1943, exactly 1 year after the 8th Air Force's first mission, 376 B-17s launched a double strike mission against the Messerschmitt aircraft factory at Regensburg and the ball-bearing plants at Schweinfurt. This was the largest and most ambitious American bombing operation attempted to that date. Curtis LeMay, now commanding the 3rd Air Division, would personally lead the Regensburg mission. The Regensburg force, consisting of 146 B-17 bombers from 7 bomb groups, would strike first, then continue south across the Alps to bases in North Africa. The Schweinfurt force, consisting of 230 B-7 bombers from 9 groups, would follow and return to England. The mission began badly. Dense fog covered English airfields. Weather delays forced a 3-hour gap between the 2 strikes instead of the planned 30 minutes. This destroyed the entire tactical plan. German radar tracked both formations from takeoff. The long delay gave German fighter controllers time to land, rearm, refuel, and attack both formations. The Regensburg force encountered German fighters almost immediately after crossing the Dutch coast. Bf-109S and FW-190S attacked in waves. The head-on attacks came first with 3 and 4 fighters abreast boring straight at the lead bombers. Despite the attacks, the formations pressed on. At Regensburg, the bombing was accurate, and the Messerschmitt factory was hit hard, but the price was high. 24 B-17s were shot down. The Schweinfurt force fared even worse. Delayed by hours, they faced German fighters that had already attacked the Regensburg force, returned to base, rearmed, and taken off again. The Schweinfurt force lost 36 B-17s out of 183 that reached the target. Combined losses for the day were 60 bombers and approximately 600 crewmen, a loss rate of 20%. Despite the losses, the combat box formations performed exactly as designed. A post-M mission survey by the USAAF analyzed loss patterns and found that over half the bombers shot down had left the protection of the main formation. Aircraft that fell out of formation due to battle damage, mechanical failure, or crew errors were quickly swarmed by German fighters. Once separated from the formation's protective firepower, a bomber typically survived less than 5 minutes before being shot down. Conversely, bombers that maintained formation discipline and stayed in their assigned positions had dramatically higher survival rates. The defensive fire forced German pilots to break off attacks sooner, made accurate gunnery difficult, and occasionally shot them down. The missions demonstrated both the strengths and limitations of the combat box. The formations could defend themselves effectively enough to reach heavily defended targets deep inside Germany and impose significant costs on attacking fighters. But without fighter escort to keep German fighters away from the formations, losses were catastrophic and unsustainable. The problem was that in August 1943, no long-range escort fighter existed. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had the performance to engage German fighters on equal terms, but its combat radius was limited. With internal fuel only, the P-47 could escort bombers to approximately 125 miles from base. With external 75 Gauss drop tanks introduced in August 1943, the radius extended to 230 meters. With 108 drop tanks introduced in September 1943, radius reached 275 miles. This was enough to cover missions to targets in the Low Countries, northern France, and western Germany, but inadequate for deep penetration missions to central Germany. While waiting for long-range escorts, the 8th Air Force continued refining the combat box to maximize defensive effectiveness. In September 1943, a new configuration was tested using a 36-plane group formation. This was created by doubling the number of 3 plane elements in each squadron, while placing all 3 planes within an element at the same time altitude to reduce collision risk. The result was a more compact formation that was easier to maintain and provided better bombing concentration. By late 1943, groups could choose between the 21-plane compact formation for small missions, the 36-plane group formation for better bombing accuracy, or the 54-plane wing formation for maximum defensive firepower. The critical test came on October 14, 1943, when the 8th Air Force returned to Schweinfurt for a second attempt to destroy the ball-bearing plants. This mission would become known as Black Thursday, the bloodiest day in 8th Air Force history. 291 B-7s took off that morning from bases across East Anglia. Weather was miserable. Assembly into formation took longer than planned. The mission was nearly scrubbed, but commanders decided to proceed. The strategic importance of Schweinfurt's ball-bearing production justified the risk. Only about half the expected P-47 escort fighters were able to rendezvous with the bomber formations. As the B-7s and their combat box formations approached Arcane on the German-Belgian border, the Thunderbolts waggled their wings in the traditional farewell gesture and turned for home, their fuel exhausted. The bombers continued alone into Germany. Then the Luftwaffe struck with unprecedented force. German fighter controllers had tracked the formations from takeoff. Every available fighter unit in Western Germany was scrambled, over 300. German fighters attacked the bomber stream in coordinated waves, single-engine Messerschmitt 109s and Fowler-Wolf, 190s came in 3 and 4 abreast, attacking head-on. The attacks were pressed home with tremendous aggression. They were followed by twin-engine fighters firing WGR-21 rockets from 1,000 yards out. The massive rockets forced formations to scatter as individual B-7s took evasive action. This broke up the combat boxes and ruined the mutually supporting defensive fire. The Luftwaffe had learned from experience and refined their tactics, specifically to break up the combat box. They focused attacks on individual groups, overwhelming local defensive capabilities. Damaged bombers that fell out of formation were immediately swarmed by German fighters. The German pilots flew from home bases in Germany, many within 50 miles of the bomber route. After expending ammunition, they would land, be rearmed and refueled in 15 to 20 minutes, and take off again to attack the same bomber stream a second or even third time. By the time the formations reached Schweinfurt, 28 bombers had already been lost. The 305th Bomb Group, LeMay's old unit, was hit particularly hard. Flying in the most exposed low groups up position, they bore the brunt of repeated attacks. 13 aircraft from a 3005th failed to return to England, the highest loss of any group on the mission. The men from the 3005th were killed, captured, or listed as missing. The bombing was accurate despite the chaos. Post-strike reconnaissance photographs showed severe damage to several production facilities, but the cost was beyond anything previously experienced. Of the 291 B-17s that departed England that morning, 60 were shot down by fighters, or flak. Another 17 returned to England so heavily damaged that they had to be scrapped. Another 121 aircraft landed with varying degrees of battle damage. Total losses represented over 26% of the attacking force. Aircrew casualties were equally severe. 650 men were lost out of 2,900 who flew the mission, representing 22% of all crews. At that loss rate, an aircrew member had virtually no chance of surviving a 25-mission tour. Staff Sergeant Harold Monroe Graham, ball turret gunner with the 3005th Bomb Group, had flown 27 missions successfully. The night before Black Thursday, Graham wrote a letter home that his family preserved. "We all know what we're facing tomorrow. Schweinfurt is the toughest target in Germany, but the formation will protect us as much as anything can. If we stay together, if we hold the box, no matter what happens, some of us will make it through. The formation gives us that chance." Graham's aircraft was shot down over Schweinfurt the next day. His bomber took several direct hits, caught fire, and went into a spin. Only 3 parachutes were seen leaving the aircraft. Graham was not among the survivors. He was 22 years old. Analysis of the mission showed once again that bombers maintaining formation discipline survived at much higher rates than those that scattered or fell out. The bombers that held their positions had better than 50% chance of reaching home. Those that fell out had almost no chance. The concentrated defensive fire had shot down some German fighters, damaged many others, and most importantly forced German pilots to break off their attacks earlier. Without the combat box, losses would have been even higher. The formation had done its job. It just wasn't enough without fighter escort. The immediate aftermath of Black Thursday forced a fundamental reassessment of American daylight bombing doctrine. The loss rates were simply too high. Crews could not be expected to survive 25 mission tours when each mission had a 20% casualty rate. For the rest of 1943, the 8th Air Force limited its operations to targets within range of fighter, escorts to deep penetration missions to targets in Central and Southern Germany were suspended indefinitely, but this was not a defeat, rather a necessary operational pause while solutions were implemented. The primary solution was developing and deploying long-range fighter escorts. By late 1943, the North American P-51B Mustang was entering service with the 8th Air Force. Powered by a Packard-built Rolls-Royce Merlin engine and equipped with external drop tanks, the P-51B had a combat radius of over 650 meters, enough to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back. The Mustang combined this extraordinary range with excellent performance. At 30,000 FT altitude where bombers and German fighters operated, the P-51B could match or exceed the performance of BF-19s and FW-190s. When P-51 equipped fighter groups began escorting bomber missions in February 1944, the strategic balance shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. The combat box formations continued in use throughout the war, but their role evolved. With effective fighter escorts available, the rigid defensive formations became less critical for pure survival. Instead, they became more important for bombing accuracy. The tight formations ensured concentrated bomb patterns on target, maximizing damage. As the Luftwaffe fighter threat diminished progressively through 1944, flak became the primary danger. The 36-plane group formation, more compact and easier to maintain than the massive 54-plane wing boxes, became standard for most missions from May 1944 onward. By February 1944, when the 8th Air Force returned to Schweinfurt during the Big Week missions, everything had changed. Long-range P-51 Mustangs escorted the bombers all the way to the target and back. The B-17G, with its 13 machine guns, provided comprehensive defensive coverage. The combat box formations had been refined through 2 years of combat experience, and most importantly, the Luftwaffe was beginning to collapse under sustained attrition. German fighter losses were mounting at unsustainable rates. Experienced pilots were being killed faster than they could be replaced. The strategic air campaign that had seemed on the verge of failure in October 1943 was now succeeding. By D-Day on June 6, 1944, Allied air forces had achieved complete air supremacy over Europe. German fighters had been largely swept from the skies through systematic attrition. Bomber formations could operate with relative impunity over most of Germany. Loss rates dropped from 20% in October 1943 to 3 to 5% by mid-1944, levels that were sustainable. Crews' chances of completing 25 mission tours improved dramatically. The psychological impact was enormous. New crews arriving in theater could look at veterans who had completed tours and know that survival was possible. The effectiveness of the combat box is demonstrated by comprehensive survival statistics. Of the 12 731 B-17s built during the entire war, 4,135 were lost in combat operations, representing a loss rate of 37%. But detailed analysis shows clearly that bombers maintaining formation discipline in combat boxes had survival rates significantly higher than the overall average, while those that became separated had survival rates far below average. A bomber that fell out of formation had perhaps a 20% chance of reaching friendly territory. Most were shot down within minutes. Conversely, a bomber that maintained its position had better than 50% chance of survival even on heavily opposed missions. The difference between life and death was often nothing more than holding position in the combat box. Technical Sergeant Albert Brown, radio operator flying with the 305 Bomb Group, wrote in a letter home that was later donated to the National Air Force Museum. The formation is everything. You see a bomber fall out and you know he's done for. The fighters swarm him like sharks around blood in the water. But if you stay in the box, if you hold your position no matter what, the other bombers protect you with their guns and you protect them with yours. It's the only way any of us survive. We depend on each other absolutely. That's what gets you through. Knowing you're not alone, that if you do your job and stay in position, the formation will protect you as much as anything can in this war. The costs were horrific and must be acknowledged honestly. The 8th Air Force suffered 54,000 casualties during the combined bomber offensive, with 26,000 killed in action and 28,000 taken prisoner. To put this in perspective, the 8th Air Force casualties exceeded the entire Marine Corps casualties in the Pacific Theater. The peak losses came during the second half of 1943, when deep penetration missions without adequate fighter escort led to unsustainable loss rates. The courage required to climb into a bomber, knowing the odds were against survival, to fly through flak and fighter attacks, to stay in formation when every instinct screamed to break away, cannot be overstated. The statistical reality of the combat box remains stark and undeniable. A 54-plane combat wing of B-17Gs fielded over 700 heavy machine guns, each capable of firing 750 rounds per minute with an effective range of 3,500 ft. These guns were arranged in three-dimensional space to create overlapping fields of fire covering every possible approach angle. Any fighter attempting to attack the formation had to fly through this wall of defensive fire for several seconds. Luftwaffe analysis confirmed that German pilots found attacking intact formations extraordinarily difficult and dangerous. The defensive fire forced early breakaways, made accurate gunnery nearly impossible, and occasionally shot them down. The development of the combat box also represented a uniquely American approach to warfare that combined engineering, industrial capacity, and tactical innovation. Where other nations might have abandoned daylight bombing after discovering its costs, the Americans engineered a solution. They analyzed the problem systematically, studied loss patterns, experimented with different formations, and refined tactics based on combat results. The solution required massive industrial capacity to build thousands of heavy bombers, each carrying 13 heavy machine guns and 7,500 rounds of ammunition. Building 12,000 B-17 required millions of man-hour and coordination across dozens of states. The solution also required training infrastructure to teach tens of thousands of pilots, navigators, bombarders, and gunners to operate as coordinated teams. The logistics of training, transporting, and integrating these crews into combat operations represented an organizational challenge as demanding as the combat itself. The combat box was not just a tactical formation, but a manifestation of American organizational capability and industrial power. It represented using technological superiority and organizational skill to overcome tactical challenges. The Germans had better trained pilots initially and the advantage of fighting over their own territory, but they could not match American industrial production or organizational ability to coordinate mass operations. The combat box symbolized this advantage. Only a nation with the industrial capacity to build thousands of heavy bombers and the organizational capability to coordinate mass formations could execute this strategy. When Curtis LeMay first tested the formation over Loo on December 6, 1942, he was experimenting with a theoretical solution to a tactical problem. He had analyzed the defensive weaknesses of loose formations, calculated fields of fire for various gun positions, and designed a formation that maximized overlapping coverage. By the time the war ended in May 1945, less than 3 years later, the combat box had become the standard by which all bomber formations were judged. Over 12,000 B-17s flew combat missions using variations of the combat box formation. They dropped over 640,000 tons of bombs on German targets, destroying factories, oil refineries, transportation networks, and military installations. They forced the Luftwaffe into a war of attrition it could not win, and they demonstrated conclusively that with proper tactics, adequate armament, and extraordinary crew skill, daylight strategic bombing could succeed even against the most determined opposition. The men who flew in those formations understood exactly what they were doing and accepted the risks knowingly. They knew the statistics. Intelligence officers briefed them on loss rates before missions. They could count empty beds in their barracks. They attended memorial services for friends. They knew that completing a 25-mission tour required not just skill and courage, but enormous luck. The pre-mission rituals reflected this knowledge. Some men wrote letters to be mailed home if they didn't return. Others prayed. Some carried lucky charms. They put on their gear methodically, checked their equipment carefully, and walked to their aircraft with the quiet determination of men doing a job that had to be done regardless of cost. The historical significance of the combat box lies not just in its tactical effectiveness, but in what it represented about American air power doctrine. The Army Air Forces had committed to daylight precision bombing over heavily defended targets, a strategy that seemed suicidal when the RAF had already abandoned daylight bombing due to prohibitive losses. The Americans refused to abandon the concept. They believed destroying specific industrial targets was essential to winning the war, and that only daylight bombing could provide the necessary accuracy. The combat box was the solution that made daylight precision bombing, viable by concentrating defensive firepower to levels that German fighters could note easily overwhelm. The formations required extraordinary crew skill, physical stamina, and courage, flying in tight combat box formation for 8 to 10 hours at altitude and sub-zero temperatures while being attacked by fighters and surrounded by flak bursts tested men to their absolute limits. Yet thousands of crews did this repeatedly, completing 25 or more missions. Many continued flying even after completing their required tours. The sense of mission, the belief that they were helping win the war and save lives by shortening the conflicts, sustained them through experiences that would have broken lesser men. In the history of aerial warfare, few tactical innovations have had greater impact or required greater courage from the men who executed them. The combat box stands as testament to both American ingenuity and the extraordinary bravery of young men who flew tight formation through walls of fire above Hitler's Europe. These men, average age 23, many fresh from farms and small towns across America, climbed into their bombers day after day and faced odds that would have broken professional soldiers. They did this because they believed in their mission that they were fighting to end tyranny, to defend freedom, to protect their families. This belief sustained them through experiences that left psychological scars many carried for the rest of their lives. The combat box formations represent what ordinary Americans can accomplish when called upon to do extraordinary things, and they remain one of the most remarkable tactical innovations in modern military history, accomplished not through force alone, but through the combination of American industrial might, organizational genius, and the raw courage of young men who refused to accept defeat.